Portugal and Spain share the same peninsula, the same mountain ranges, the same rivers, centuries of shared kings, shared wars, shared food. Walk from Lisbon to Madrid and you'd cross land that has been united and divided more times than history can cleanly count. And yet, if you took the DNA of a person from Porto and laid it next to the DNA of a person from Salamanca, just 200 kilometers away, a trained geneticist could tell them apart. Not always, not with certainty, but with statistical consistency that has now been confirmed across multiple major studies. That difference doesn't begin with the Moors. It doesn't begin with Rome or the Visigoths or any border drawn on a map. It begins in the ice, 20,000 years ago, with a population so ancient they left no name, only bone, and the code inside it. And this is the story of why the Portuguese are, genetically, not quite Spanish. And the answer is stranger, older, and more layered than anything you were taught in school. Before we go further, have you taken a DNA ancestry test? Did the result match what your family told you, or did it completely contradict it? Leave it in the comments. Because what this research found about Portuguese ancestry might make you look at your own results differently. To understand why Portugal is genetically distinct, you have to go back to the worst climate event in human prehistory, the Last Glacial Maximum, roughly 26,000 years ago. The interior of what we now call Spain was essentially uninhabitable. Average temperatures in the Meseta, that flat, high plateau at the center of the peninsula, dropped to around -10 degrees Celsius. No forests. Almost no large animals. No people. If a group of hunter-gatherers wandered into that landscape, they wouldn't last a season. But the Atlantic coastline was different. The Atlantic Ocean acts as a thermal regulator. It absorbs heat in summer and releases it in winter, keeping coastal temperatures survivable even when everything inland is frozen. And so, a narrow strip of land, running from what is now Lagos in the south to Braga in the north, the precise geography that would one day become Portugal, became a refuge. Small bands of hunter-gatherers held on there, for millennia, huddled against the ocean while the ice locked out the world around them. We call them Magdalenian hunter-gatherers. We can trace them through their stone tools, their cave art, their burial sites, and now, through their DNA. This is the first layer, and it never fully disappears. In 2019, geneticist Inigo Olalde and his team at Harvard Medical School's Broad Institute published a landmark study analyzing the ancient DNA of 271 individuals from across the Iberian Peninsula, spanning the last 8,000 years. The finding that stopped the room: there was a measurable genetic gradient running east to west across Iberia. People from the Atlantic coast, modern-day Portugal and the northwestern corner of Spain, consistently clustered differently from people in the interior and the east. Not dramatically different, not like comparing Europeans to East Asians, but statistically, persistently, detectably different. Then, in 2025, Xavier Roca-Rada and his team at the University of Adelaide and the University of Lisbon published the most comprehensive ancient genome study ever conducted specifically on Portugal. They sequenced 67 ancient individuals spanning 5,000 years of Portuguese prehistory. Their conclusion reinforced and deepened what Olalde had found. The Atlantic edge of Iberia, what became Portugal, showed the highest concentrations of Ice Age ancestry anywhere on the peninsula. That ancient Magdalenian lineage survived immeasurably higher proportions there than anywhere further north, east, or inland. The reason is geography. When the ice retreated around 12,000 years ago and humans began re-expanding across Europe, they did so from two main starting points: the Atlantic refugees in the southwest and population centers in Eastern Europe. And their descendants exist today, in different proportions depending on where you live in Europe. And on the Iberian Peninsula, the Atlantic edge retained more of the southwestern lineage than anywhere else, simply because that's where those people already were. Here is where the story becomes deeply strange. Around 2500 BCE, a new wave of people began arriving on the Iberian Peninsula from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the grasslands north of the Black Sea. We call them steppe pastoralists. They were probably the first speakers of Proto-Indo-European languages, ancestors of most modern European languages, including Spanish and Portuguese. Olalde's team detected something extraordinary in the genomic record. Within 400 to 500 years of their arrival in Iberia, or the Y chromosome, the male lineage of the previous population, was replaced almost entirely. The haplogroups I2, G2A, and related lineages that had defined Iberian men for thousands of years, men who had built megalithic tombs, who worked gold, who left their mark across the peninsula, simply vanished from the genetic record. In their place, the R1b haplogroup, carried by men from the steppe. This was near complete replacement, virtually 100%. Olalde called it, carefully in the language of science, one of the most extreme examples of sex-biased admixture in the prehistoric period. Because it's not just the numbers. The maternal line, mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to child, shows far more continuity. The women carried the old lineages forward through a period when the male lineages were being replaced. Now, what did this replacement look like from the outside? We don't have written records. We have no accounts of battles, no massacre sites with evidence of mass violence that could fully explain the scale of what happened. What we have is the genome itself, which records the outcome. Steppe-derived men reproduced. Pre-steppe men, largely, did not. At a Bronze Age site in Portugal, archaeologists found something that crystallized this. A parent-offspring pair, mother and son, buried together. The son carried the R1b steppe Y chromosome. His mother's mitochondrial DNA was pre-steppe Atlantic lineage. A snapshot, the old world and the new, joined in one family, preserved in one grave. Here is where Portugal diverges from Spain in the Bronze Age. The steppe migration happened across the entire peninsula. It was sweeping and transformative. But the 2025 study by Roca-Rada's team found something critical. The steppe autosomal ancestry, the overall genomic contribution from steppe populations, beyond just the Y chromosome, is measurably lower in Portugal, especially in western and northern Portugal, than in central and eastern Spain. The Atlantic edge absorbed the Bronze Age migration, but absorbed it less completely. Why? The answer lies in the water. A specific Y chromosome haplogroup, called R1b DF27, spread across Iberia during the Bronze Age, but its distribution is not even. In the interior of the peninsula, it sits at around 50% of men overall. But on the Atlantic coast, in Portugal specifically, it hits 70% or higher in some areas. That's not how a land-based migration distributes. Land-based migrations spread outward gradually and more evenly. The pattern of R1b DF27 concentration on the coast points to maritime routes, boats moving people and genes along the Atlantic shoreline from Portugal to Brittany to Ireland. Portugal was not just receiving the Bronze Age migration. It was also a hub that exported a version of it, a maritime version, up the Atlantic coast of Europe. The result was that while the steppe genetics settled into the peninsula, the Atlantic coast developed a distinct genetic profile, not separate from Europe, but differently weighted. More Atlantic Bronze Age, less Eastern steppe. This is why a man from Braga today clusters genetically closer to someone from County Clare in Ireland than to someone from Zaragoza 200 kilometers away. There is a Bronze Age trade route, still visible in living DNA, connecting the Atlantic coast from Portugal to Ireland. And 3,000 years of subsequent history have not erased it. While the male lineages were being replaced during the Bronze Age, the maternal line tells a different story. Roca-Rada's team tracked mitochondrial haplogroups, the inheritance passed from mother to child across thousands of years of Portuguese prehistory. What they found was striking continuity. Haplogroups tied to the Magdalenian Ice Age survivors, U5b1, U5b1c, U5b2b, and related lineages, persist in Portuguese sites even after the Bronze Age transition. At a Chalcolithic cave site in Portugal, the same lineages appear on both sides of the Bronze Age divide. The women carried something forward that the male-dominated migration could not fully reach. Think about what this means for identity. Well, the Spanish-Portuguese genetic difference is not only about who came to the peninsula, it is also about who stayed through every wave of migration. The Atlantic edge didn't just receive people, it retained them. The maternal lineages running through modern Portuguese people are, in some cases, more persistent, more continuous, more durable than what we see in central and eastern Iberia. Portugal has an older maternal memory than most of its neighbors, and that memory runs all the way back to the ice. The Ice Age Foundation and the Bronze Age Maritime Network form the deepest layers, but history kept adding. The Romans arrived in Iberia around 218 BCE and stayed for 6 centuries. They built roads, cities, aqueducts. They spread Latin, the ancestor of both Spanish and Portuguese. Their genetic contribution to the peninsula exists, but it is modest. Rome moved ideas and institutions more than it moved genes into Iberia in large quantities. The Suebi, the layer nobody talks about. In 411 CE, as the Roman Empire fractured, a Germanic people called the Suebi crossed the Rhine and pushed west across Gaul and into Iberia. When they ran out of land, they stopped. In modern-day northwestern Portugal and Galicia, they established a kingdom, the Kingdom of the Suebi, that lasted for 170 years before being absorbed by the Visigoths. Roca-Rada's 2025 study confirmed a Central European genetic admixture concentrated in exactly the region the Suebi settled, northwestern Portugal. Not huge, not transformative, but measurable. A Germanic fingerprint deposited in the founding population of what would become Portugal. We know this kingdom partly because of one man, Hydatius of Chaves, a bishop who spent his life in a small Roman town in Galicia and kept a chronicle, the Chronicon, that is our primary written source for the Suebi kingdom. He negotiated with their kings. He watched their wars. His writing survived in an 8th century manuscript. Without it, the Suebi of Portugal would be nearly invisible. But they left something that no manuscript could capture, and the genome recorded it. The Moors, a layer that matters more in the south. In 711 CE, the first Islamic army crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and within a decade had swept across nearly the entire peninsula. For the next 7 centuries, parts of Iberia were under Moorish rule, longer in the south than the north. The genetic signature of this period is real, and it shows up as North African ancestry in modern Iberians. But here is the critical detail. This signal runs in the opposite direction from the Atlantic signal. North African ancestry in Iberia points southeast, toward North Africa and the eastern Mediterranean. The Atlantic signal points northwest, toward Ireland, Brittany, the coast. Both signals are stronger in Portugal than in Spain. Both are present in the same genomes at the same time. The Islamic period explains one layer, and it shaped southern Portugal profoundly. Portugal completed its Reconquista, its reconquest of Moorish territory, in 1249 CE, nearly 2.5 centuries before Spain's final reconquest in 1492. The regions that broke free earliest show less North African ancestry. The south, which was under Islamic rule longest, shows more. But the Moorish layer sits on top of something that was already there before 711 CE, before the first Roman soldier, before any king. The oldest difference between Portugal and Spain is not medieval. It is not even ancient in the conventional sense. It is prehistoric. If you want to see what pre-Bronze Age Iberia looked like genetically, the Basques offer the closest living approximation. The Basque language, Euskara, has no known relatives anywhere in the world. It predates the Indo-European languages that arrived with the Bronze Age steppe migrations. And genetics confirms what linguistics suggests. Present-day Basques are best described as a population that largely absorbed the Bronze Age Y chromosome replacement, but retained more pre-steppe autosomal ancestry than their neighbors. They were enclosed by geography, mountains, limited contact, and that enclosure preserved something. R1b DF27, that Atlantic Bronze Age haplogroup, appears in roughly 70% of Basque men, the highest concentration anywhere in Europe. A Bronze Age pattern frozen in a population that the Iron Age largely bypassed. The Basques are not fossils. They have lived through Christianity, industrialization, political upheaval, the modern world. But their genome carries a reflection of what Iberia looked like before everything else arrived. And that reflection is more Atlantic, more ancient, more continuous than what you find anywhere further east. Most people who encounter this topic encounter it first through a consumer DNA test, the kind you mail in with a saliva sample. Here's the problem. Those tests build their ancestry reference panels from living people. When a company assigns you a percentage of Iberian Peninsula ancestry, their algorithm is asking, which living population do you most resemble? If that reference panel lumped all Portuguese and Spanish test takers into a single Iberian Peninsula categories, which many early panels did, then the deep genetic differences we've just discussed become invisible. The algorithm can't see what the reference panel doesn't separate. Companies have improved. After adding more Portuguese reference individuals and increasing the resolution of their panels, some have started showing distinct Portuguese versus Spanish assignments for the first time. A corporate algorithm caught up to what academic research had been showing for years. If you're Portuguese or have Portuguese ancestry, and your results have historically shown only Spanish or Iberian, a more recent run with more granular reference data may look different. The science was always there. The tools just needed time to catch up. 5 separate genetic layers, all pointing in the same direction, all measurably more concentrated in the territory that became Portugal than in the rest of the peninsula. Ice Age Atlantic survivors, preserved longest on the coast that stayed warm. A Bronze Age maritime network that moved genes up the Atlantic seaboard, while the interior absorbed a different pattern. Germanic settlers, who stopped at the edge of the continent and stayed. A Moorish period whose genetic signal runs in a completely different direction, but is also stronger in Portugal. And an ancient maternal continuity that survived every male-dominated migration, carrying Ice Age lineages forward into the modern world. This is not noise. This is not a rounding error in the data. 5 independent layers, independently documented, all pointing the same way. That is architecture. Portugal is genetically distinct from Spain, not because of any single event, but because of where it sits. Because the Atlantic edge has always been the Atlantic edge. Because the people who survived the ice did it there. Because the people who sailed the Bronze Age did it from there. Because every wave that came after landed on a population that had already been shaped by what came before. The border between Portugal and Spain was drawn in 1143 CE, when Afonso Henriques broke from the Kingdom of Galicia and declared independence. But the genetic boundary that border eventually traced, however imperfectly, however with overlap at the edges, predates that decision by thousands of years. The question that ancient DNA research eventually forces you to ask is this: what exactly are we describing when we say Portuguese? Is it a population defined by Ice Age survival, Bronze Age maritime trade, Suebi settlement, Moorish rule, and a specific maternal continuity, all of it concentrated in the western edge of the peninsula? Or is it a political identity shaped by the decisions of kings? The answer is both, and the two cannot be separated. The genome doesn't lie about the science. It was just waiting for us to have the tools to read it. If this changed how you think about your own ancestry, or if you've taken a DNA test and seen something unexpected in your Portuguese or Iberian results, tell me in the comments. I read everyone. Subscribe for more stories like this. The next one goes even deeper.